Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Jackson, and um, on my capstone project, I had the pleasure to work with Deja Johnson, Spencer Robertson, and Ashley Moss. And the our discussion was on the misdiagnosis of mental health in the African American community. Before I start going into detail about what I'll be discussing, I just want to give you an idea of how we went about um, deciding on what we were going to discuss in our literature review and as far as our actual poster. Um, as a group, we all sat together and we brought our articles together, and we actually went through each one of our articles, and we filtered out different themes, and we um kept track of the most common themes that we seen that came up, and that's how we decided on what we were going to write about. So some of the common themes that we came across was professional bias, social economic disparities, which was my topic that I discussed, culture competence, and racial disparities. So, just to give you an idea of how we went about what we were going to talk about. um, so just to um give you like an idea of what I want you guys to take away from this video. Um, we just wanted to bring attention to some of the factors that we believe is the reason behind so many African Americans being misdiagnosed um, with different mental illnesses. And we also just wanted to bring attention to uh, some things as a social worker for us to be aware of, as far as when we are out there practicing and what we can do to kind of prevent this from happening. So, um, my my topic was social economic disparities, and you'll see in my PowerPoint and as well as our poster that we included a graph, and it has mood disorders, schizophrenia, alcohol related disorders, and substance abuse related disorders. And it's just a graph showing you the different races and how often people are diagnosed among those races. And of course, within the schizophrenia department, African Americans do have the highest diagnosis in that particular department. So, let's just talk about social economic statuses. A socioeconomic status is determined by an individual's income, educational achievement, financial capabilities, uh, social statuses, and social classes. Unfortunately, though, we know that the African American community have had a long history of discrimination, um, and all types of abuse and slavery. So we have not had the same playing field as our white counterparts. So now during this time, you're seeing a lot of African Americans prospering, but that was not always the case. So we've had to face mass incarceration, poverty, just all types of different trials and tribulations to make our life a lot harder. And what people fail to realize is that some of those things that we went through is part of the reason why um, we're so badly misrepresented in the behavioral health field. Um, so my responsibility was to focus on the social economic disparities. And the one that I wanted to focus on the most was education. So let's get into it. One of the most common social economic factors that contributes to misdiagnosis is education. Um, Education influences whether or not an individual can understand and question complete diagnoses, complicated diagnoses that have been given to a client. So let's give you an example, such as you have a African American male that comes in and he has been diagnosed by his provider by having schizophrenia. If that client doesn't have proper education, and he doesn't necessarily have to be college graduate, just being able to understand the right questions that need to be asked, he probably won't be properly informed on his diagnosis. So let's say that the provider tells him that he has schizophrenia. So at this point, with proper education, this would be the time for him to utilize um, his right to ask questions. So he should ask questions such as, well, how did it come along that he got it, or how can he maintain this illness? What could he have done differently to prevent it? He could ask so many questions, but if he lacks education or he doesn't know exactly which questions to ask, then the answers that he may need, he may never receive it because the provider may not think that far or may not feel as if it's that important to explain it to him. Um, Another thing we talked about were clinicians are more likely to be hesitant of diagnosing people with complicated illnesses if they see that a client is fully understanding and is capable of asking questions and holding the provider responsible for a explanation as to why they're being diagnosed a specific illness. Also, a client who has more education is more likely to ask follow-up questions to diagnoses and are more likely to do their own research to gain an understanding. So, if I do go to the doctor and the doctor tells me that I have schizophrenia, okay, I'll take it, but I'm also going to take the time to do my own research to see what the research says as far as what are the symptoms for it and what does the disease look like before I actually embrace that diagnosis. So that's why I chose to talk about the education part of it. Um, I also took the time to look at some of the research, and there was a study that was performed by Barnes in 2013 that found that among 4 different hospitals, African Americans were more likely to be overdiagnosed with schizophrenia compared to the Caucasian people. In Barnes' 2013 research, he found that the misdiagnosis of schizophrenia was not clearly explained, but there were some common factors among those who were diagnosed. So, once again, this comes along with the education part. So, providers are giving these diagnoses to people, but they're not thoroughly explaining to them an explanation of those diagnoses. So that goes along again with, okay, so this is what you're saying I have, so I need to hold you responsible as far as explaining to me what is this and how can I be fully functional with this diagnosis. Um, So I also wanted to make note that African American clients are not the only ones that I say that the education is a problem for. So not only do we have to worry about lack of education among African Americans, but we also have to consider there to be a lack of education amongst the service providers that are offering these services to African Americans. They may be intelligent as far as um, being able to diagnose, but they're missing an understanding of the culture uh, that influences African Americans' behavior. So there may some things that they're taking, such as like um, African Americans tend to be a little bit more aggressive, and they may try to use that as being a symptom for a mental illness, and that may not necessarily be a symptom, or that may not be a symptom for um, a client. That just may be how they are. That just may be part of their nature. So there's definitely a lack of education in service providers understanding um, how African Americans express themselves culturally as well. So I think that also has to contribute with why there's such a high misdiagnosis of mental illnesses amongst the African American community. So, what can we do as social workers to prevent this? Um, Education. We have to educate ourselves on the culture history. And that's not even just on African Americans, but on any culture that we may be working with. We have to educate ourselves on the people that we are coming into contact with, because it's so easy for us to develop stereotypes about people without truly understanding um, their culture backgrounds. And I don't think that we ever want to just get comfortable in uh, interacting with people in the same way. Everyone has different needs, and we have to be able to adjust to what a client needs. So we definitely have to educate ourselves on the culture. Um, Also, for us, we have to continue to recruit African American service providers. There's a lot of African Americans that are in need of behavior health services. So we need to be on the front lines for our people, making sure that we're giving them what we need, because we know what it's like to be black. Um, we know, I mean, we may have not dealt with the same circumstances, but we have an idea of at least where to begin with one another. So there's always a need to have more African American service providers out there. Um, and not only that, but we also need to allow our clients to be their own expert of their experience. They know what they're experiencing more so than anyone else. So it's okay to sit back and just listen to what they have going on. We we're not trying to create their story for them. Their story is already created. We're just trying to help them make sense of it. So we need to always allow for the client to lead as being their own expert, so that we don't um, misguide them. And in conclusion, there is a need for social workers to be knowledgeable and comfortable with working with people regardless of their race, gender, sexuality, economic status, um, and that goes for despite of what service is being provided. There's literature out there that has provided evidence that the following key factors, which include professional bias, social economic disparities, cultural competency, and racial disparities. These four components are highly associated with the misdiagnosis of mental health within the African American community. Not only does this literature use within the context shed light on the causes of misdiagnosis, but the literature also calls for the urgency for implications to address the social issues. So I just want for us moving forward just to be mindful of the people that we come in contact with and making sure that we allow for people to tell their stories and we don't mistake some of the things that they've been through culturally as a symptom. And that's it. Thank you.